Chapter 6. Jacobs. He always said a man would do what he could for redemption. I always thought I knew what he meant. I understand more every day. I'm most grateful to have learned from him. Days, weeks had passed. Matt could no longer keep track. He could do little else but sit in his room healing again. Isolated with his thoughts, he was alone. A well of anger burned inside him. It was useless, he knew, and that thought just made it worse. In this, he was caught, an endless cycle. What was at first anger evolved into despair, and then hopelessness. He spent these days in front of the television for hours and hours. The others at the lodge hardly spoke to him. His body left him stranded at the lodge. Matt had begun to believe this was his purpose. To sit in rooms, isolated, thinking. Outside, the world was in chaos. The same broadcast, over and over, was all the insight they had. Those who left didn't return. This was a scary idea. The only light Matt had was his visits from Angela. She would talk about her father. He would only listen, smile when he needed to. Angela did what a little girl could do to take care of him. She tucked him in and brought him food. Her sunny disposition was the best part of Matt's days. These days were spent in bed watching TV, only hoping to learn something. But there was never any news, and soon, this habit just seemed in vain. There was just destruction, just death. Matt's hopelessness grew with each passing day. He and everyone else at the lodge felt more and more isolated as time went on. He hardly ever saw John, who survived the crash with him. He had wondered if he was all right. John's own sense of fear and isolation caused him to keep to himself. The phones were now completely dead, and cell phones were useless, inoperable. The mail stopped coming and going. The systems in the world that kept the motor of societies moving had ceased to run. And still, they didn't know exactly who or what caused this destruction. Time went on. Hope began to fade. Matt, preparing for the worst, wondered how long the power would stay on. It seemed only inevitable with the state of things. The electric would go off sooner or later. He worried. Everyone had their opinions. Some believed the National Guard would swoop in and save them, save the day. Others believed it would be the WPF. Jimmy believed the Chinese had attacked us, attempting to blow us off the map. Arguments would break out. Political arguments. Matt thought it was silly at this point, but rationalized that everyone has their pride. For now, they felt safe for the most part, but it seemed a safe bet that eventually the world would find them. Feelings of desperateness increased at the lodge, that this was the end of something, that something had left his world, a spirit, some light, or something greater settled in each person at the lodge. The only thing that could be done was to wait for some sign or something pointing in some direction. And until then, survive. Matt wasn't sure what day it was. It had been some time since the crash, or maybe it was just a few days. He wasn't sure. He sat in bed with only the bedside light on. The communication among one another at the lodge was business as usual. The normalcy bias had taken over. Everyone was acting normal, as if there was such a thing. Perhaps this was an attempt to hide from the truth. They remained burrowed away from an unknown danger. Yet they understood, somehow, it would eventually reveal itself to them. Matt guessed it had to be sometime in the middle of September. He wondered what had happened to his home, his sister, his family, and Stephanie. A cloud of stagnation fell around him in his reverie. His injured body fogged his thought process. Tonight, the darkest demons of his past would not leave him alone. It had become a hellish life, chasing and prodding at him in an unbearable amalgamation tonight. The aching in his body, the impossibility of the situation that had settled around him on this brisk fall night. Matt wanted to give up. He wanted to get up and leave, run home. He knew in his heart of hearts that home no longer existed. He had done nothing but sleep for the time he had been at the lodge, in and out of consciousness, except for his visits from Angela. He wanted, no, needed to understand. The answers weren't coming soon enough. Tonight, it felt as though his body was dying on him. Maybe it was just his heart aching, suffocating for home. He could hear his mother's voice in the silence, calling through the bleak trees of fall. He wept. Something in him was gone. Something had died. It was parts of him, parts of home. With his chin tucked into his chest, he could not see through the veil of tears. He was weak. The despair had caught up to him. Where was Stephanie? Dead in the attacks? The not knowing wore on him. He could not live knowing she wasn't alive. At this moment, there was nothing truer. It was a cold evil, blotting out the fires of hope. Long ago, maybe it was another life now, she had sung to him in his despair. Her voice fell into his ear, crushing the force of tears that raged through his body. Her strength fed into him a song that could never be crushed, and as the song from her angelic voice easily defeated the despair that would overcome him, he joined her in her strength. The tumor of despair invaded his heart, wrinkled it away. She was always his antidote for his despair in their youth. His spirit was reminded that all his sadness was nothing when the two of them stood together. They were the permanence of constellations, seeing the hard world below them. Now, this was gone from him. The memory of her pure brown eyes easing the blows of the world in his young life. They were now scars. They were now pain. They slashed from end to end of his soul. The physical pain made no comparison to that of what his heart suffered. Every passionate feeling he experienced of her came to him in one striking gust. Now, she was gone from him, gone from the world. He could feel it. He knew it to be true. All his greatest hopes that he had had for his life invested in her, invested in their love, in their permanence, a permanence he ultimately shattered with one swing, ending the magic he had once believed in. They were the childhood wishes she symbolized to him. Gone. He tried to make it without her, and here he was, at the end of it all. Matt raged at himself inside, filled with fury at the way he had done things. It all led him here, tonight, to find this message waiting for him in the stillness. She was gone. She no longer existed. She was no longer there for him to go back to. There was no earthly way, no hope. Matt gave in, ravaged in this holy night. He let his mind take him to her memory, her voice, though he knew by some supernatural intuition she did not exist in this world anymore. The night closed in on him. Her memory came to him, like the summoning of spirits to protect and save him. He sobbed silently in his grief. It was just enough to settle his mind and ease the pain of his broken body. Matt woke to hear a stirring in the room. He immediately took guard, stirring in his bed. He reached for a firearm that was not there. It was still, but there was something there. Matt could hear someone's breath. "Who's there?" Matt said into the darkness. "It's me," said a young girl's voice. Matt knew it was Angela. She came to him in embrace. She was crying. Matt held her. What's wrong, honey? Matt asked. I miss him. Matt filled his eyes well with tears. He knew he was not alone in this sadness. He had been distant from Angela. She is basically alone through all this. Matt chastised himself for not paying enough attention to her. Oh, sweetie, he's in heaven, Matt said, his voice shaking with tears. You'll see him again, but I'm going to take care of you now, okay? Okay, she said with such stark, hopeful naivety. I love you, Matt, said the little girl's small voice. Oh, I love you too, Matt returned. Angela climbed into his bed, and they slept. Matt woke once again, looked around the room. The surroundings were too familiar now. Yet, something was different here. He heard loud voices outside of the lodge. Someone yelling. They were shouting orders. He sat up and turned on the light. Angela lay peacefully sleeping next to him. He was quiet enough to get up and leave the room without disturbing her. There were others stirring in the hallway. Who's out there? Matt asked. No reply. Matt followed them down to the lobby. They tiptoed, as if they were sneaking up on someone. The voices were getting louder. The three men shared looks, trying to gauge the severity of the situation. Suddenly, there came a crash at the door. It burst open. A man came through, carrying an injured woman. Several others followed. They appeared to be dressed in military attire, the green and beige of camouflage. Someone turned on the light. There was another man who looked like he had been beaten. He was greasy-looking and had regular clothes, torn except for a camo vest. The others were similarly dressed. There was urgency amongst the group. From just beyond the lobby door, there was a line of 20 or so men and women. They appeared to be civilians. The military-garbed man, who appeared to be leading, laid down the woman he was carrying onto the lobby floor. As the light revealed, she was covered in blood. We need help, the man shouted. Medical supplies. Do you have a first aid kit? The three men of the lodge stood motionless. Hey, the man screamed. Someone turned on the light. Matt looked to the man in the hallway. It was John from the crash. Matt turned to the other, Jimmy. Where's the first aid kit? Matt asked, trying to inspire urgency. Jimmy ran into the main kitchen. Matt followed. Jimmy opened a cupboard and fumbled at a plastic box with a red X on it. The first aid kit. Matt snapped it from his hands and ran back to the lobby. The man holding the woman on the floor opened the woman's blouse, revealing her bloody torso. He seemed to know what he was doing as Matt stood over him. What happened? Matt asked. The man continued working. He didn't answer. He began shouting orders to the others behind him. The soldiers had huge automatic weapons. Matt identified them from his time in the WPF. Alder, take 3 and guard the perimeter. The men quickly appeared to follow orders. I need room for her. Matt stood still. Now! Matt snapped to and led him up the staircase. They entered one of the many vacant rooms. The soldier followed, laid her on the bed. Who's in charge here? The soldier asked. Matt took initiative. I am. Great. You're already half dead, he replied, looking Matt up and down. He quickly dismissed his comment and went on. What happened, you ask? Now, he was answering Matt's question. She was stabbed. By who? I don't know. But they're following us. They'll be here any second. The soldier glanced at the bloody woman on the bed. She won't make it. He turned and left. Matt stood in the grotesque view of the woman's body. Intestines and flesh pouring from her abdomen. There was still a shallow rise and fall in her chest. Matt hurried to the bed, put pressure on her wounds. He knew it was useless. He tried to get her to regain consciousness. There was gunfire outside the window. Overwhelmed, not sure what to do, Matt hurried to look out and see what he could see. Blood on his hands. He panicked. Angela! He yelled. The sun rose slowly. It began to shine through the window. Matt stood, looking at the dead woman. She still lay on the bed. He was not able to fully comprehend what was happening. The man who carried her came in. She's dead? He asked. Matt shook his head. He turned to see Angela standing at the doorway, her face aghast. She ran. Matt rose to chase her, but the soldier stopped him with a hand to his chest. He looked down at Matt's blood-soiled hands. "Is she your girl?" he asked. "No, yes, I guess she is now," Matt said. "We need to stay here for a few days," the soldier replied. "Okay." Matt had no idea how to act. "There are 18 of us." The man paused and thought. "You said you were in charge?" Matt was speechless, searching for words. "Hello? There are rooms on the 3rd floor. No one's up there yet," Matt finally said. "Okay, if you're in charge here, I need you to act like it." The soldier turned, walked out of the room, leaving only Matt and a dead woman. Matt found Angela back in his room. She was upset and hiding. He was able to comfort her so that she could go back to sleep. However, he would not be sleeping. He went to the lobby to watch TV. There was new footage of New York City. It was completely destroyed. It was empty now. Bridges had fallen, and the power gone. It didn't appear anyone made it in that city. The broadcast played a few times, and unexpectedly, the TV shut off. Matt felt nothing now. He was numb. He needed air. Outside the lodge, it was autumn, as could be told from the brisk chill in the night air. He walked into the woods. He looked at the colored leaves. He came to a dirt mound. He hadn't noticed this before. 15 men, came a voice from behind. Matt turned to see the soldier from the night before. "Jacobs," the man said, extending his hand. Matt said. "Come on now. What the hell is your last name?" "Blair," he replied. "Are you in WPF?" "Was," Jacobs replied. "Where'd you come from? Philly?" "What the fuck is going on?" Matt demanded. "The end of the world, I think. I don't think anyone knows. Armageddon is the easiest way to explain it." Jacobs lit a cigarette. He offered one. "No thanks. There won't be many pleasures the rest of your life. You'd better smoke." Jacobs smiled. Matt took a cigarette. There was a moment of silence. "What's going on?" Matt asked, more calmly this time. Jacobs flashed a serious look. "Blair, I got a job I need you to do." Jacobs wasn't smiling now. He was giving orders. His demeanor completely changed. "I need you to take care of the civvies here. The folks we got out of Philly, I'll leave 2 of my men to guard. There are many more." "What the fuck is happening out there?" Matt interrupted. He was frightened. It was obvious. "Blair, don't lose your head on me. I need your help." "Yeah? Well, I need to know what's going on." Matt felt unstable in the moment. Why was she being chased? Armageddon? Is that funny to you? Matt was shouting. "Yeah, it is funny," Jacobs laughed. Matt was infuriated with his response. He attempted to make himself calm, at least on the surface. "What did you see in Philly?" Jacobs walked closer, pointed a finger at Matt to enhance his point. "I saw the same thing you'll see in D.C., in Seattle, L.A., New York." "Tell me what the fuck is going on," Matt said. "Come on, Blair. Would you listen to yourself? Can you handle what the hell is going on out there? You want to know what's going on? Millions of people are dead. Millions will die from the fallout. You could be next. Your best chance is to do as I tell you." Matt looked at the mound. "You're in this now," Jacobs continued. "I don't have any other answers for you. Are you happy?" "What about D.C.? Is it gone?" Matt asked. "Of course it's fucking gone. You don't think they're gonna hit the Capitol?" "Who did—" "I told you, Blair. I don't fucking know." Jacobs was quickly losing his patience. Matt began to cry, though he tried to hide it. "Jesus Christ. You're just a kid," Jacobs said. "How can it be that it's you that's in charge?" It seemed Jacobs was more or less asking himself the question. Matt sucked up his tears. He turned to Jacobs, displaying a face of new strength. "I was in the WPF 3 years. I'm the only one here trained in any way for this," Matt starkly stated. "I'm in charge." Jacobs stared long and hard. The man was stone-faced. There was a strong purpose underneath his ragged military experience. "Well, all right then. Let's get breakfast," he said lightly, defying his appearance. "Alder!" Jacob shouted across the small dining hall at the lodge. "Where the hell is Alder?" One of his men came to him and whispered something to him. Jacobs winced, then announced, "All right then, I'll make breakfast." And so, breakfast was made on this early morning. Jacob took his seat across from Matt. "We've got a truck a mile or two, some guns. We're heading back to get more people and bring them here. We'll go today to get more artillery from the truck. Then we'll head back this way. Your WPF training should suit you well for this." His men looked towards them at these words. "You just want me to sit here and wait?" Matt asked. "I don't think you're going far with that arm," Jacobs said tauntingly. Matt looked down at his arm. Jacobs ate his eggs. When he was almost finished, he took his mug of coffee. He raised his glass and said, "Here's to Alder, who I knew for many years. Let's hope he finds some good rest." He bowed his head. Then he got up without a word and walked out of the lodge dining hall. Angela came to Matt's table. She sat in front of him, where Jacobs had just left. "I wanted to eat breakfast too, Matt," she said. "Well, eat up," Matt said with a smile. He loaded up her plate with some silver-dollar pancakes. She ate. Matt could tell her gears were turning. He was scared what she would say next. He didn't know how to answer some of the questions she had sometimes. "Matt, why did that lady die?" Matt sat, stumped. He decided he'd have to be straight with her. "She was hurt by bad people," Matt explained. "Why are there so many bad people now?" she asked. "Things have changed a little bit in the world, honey. We have to be extra careful now," Matt reassured her. "Don't worry. I'll take care of you." She smiled big at Matt. "Okay." She finished her pancakes. Later, Matt waited outside of the lodge for the men to return. He saw 4 of them finally come from the east side of the woods. John had gone with them. He returned with 15 automatic rifles hanging from his shoulders. John seemed to be doing better more recently than he was in the days immediately following the crash. Matt felt badly now that he had not spent more time with him. Matt led them up to the 3rd floor to what would become the gun room. The group settled into their rooms. Matt could not sleep, as was becoming the norm. Angela, who now shared her room with him, was fast asleep. He went outside to enjoy the sky that he and his sister had shared not so long ago. The moon was out. It was bright. Matt longed for home. He walked to the front of the lodge, heard a voice from around the corner. He listened. It was a melodic voice. Someone sang into the night. Matt didn't recognize the song. It was before his time. He walked slowly around the corner. It was Jacobs doing the singing. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Blair," he said, as he noticed Matt, ceasing his singing. "Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt." "Sit down, Blair," Jacobs said. Matt obliged, and they both sat silently. "It's a nice night," Jacobs said. "Yeah," Matt said. "So, what's your story, Blair? Why in the hell are you in the middle of Pennsylvania? Plane crash." Matt lifted his arm, as if to explain it. "Shit," Jacobs replied. "You made it? Now I see. The little girl made it too?" "Yeah, but her father didn't." "So now you're daddy, eh? And you were in the WPF?" "Yeah, 3 years. Last March, I saw action in Argentina. Laid me up for 6 months. Shot 7 times. I tried to go on vacation, and here I am." "Vacation?" Jacobs asked. "Wyoming." "Okay. Sounds like a long story." "Yeah, I guess it is," Matt said. There was a pause, as they both looked to the sky. "You're a good man for taking care of that little girl," Jacobs said. "I wish that meant something." Matt complained. "Come on, Blair, you're kind of a whiner, aren't you?" Jacobs said. "You're alive, aren't you?" "Yeah, but no one I know or love is," Matt rebutted. "Well, how do you know?" "I'm from Baltimore," Matt said, looking over to him. "Well, you never know," Jacobs reassured. Matt resented his hopefulness, his false hopefulness. "What happened to that woman?" Matt asked. Jacobs' face looked concerned, pensive. "We heard screams. Bunch of guys had her. I don't know what they were doing. I can only assume the worst. We drove up in the truck. They fired on us. Their mistake. People are acting crazy everywhere. You can't trust anyone. Not even me," Jacobs said, trying to illustrate a lesson to his young listener. "It's Armageddon, remember?" "Right," Matt replied. Just be careful, he continued. There might be more crazy wanderers coming through this way. So what do we do? Matt asked. Well, you stay here and take care of these people. Take care of yourself. Your arm looks pretty fucked. We're gonna go. We're gonna get more people out of the danger zone. People are sick, hurt, dying. We need to set up here as a safe zone. Fallout won't reach here. Even then, the foothills will take care of you. Then, we'll go from there. That's it? Matt asked. That's it, Jacobs replied. We can't just stay here. I don't want to stay here, Matt said. Look at your arm, Matt. No offense. But you aren't going to help anyone. Just stay here. We'll be back when we figure out what the situation is out there. Great. This sounds like a lot of fun, Matt said. Hey, there he is. That's the funny guy. Jacobs laughed, slapped him on the shoulder. Yeah, hilarious. They both laughed. You know, you remind me of Alder, Jacobs said. He was good. He does have a serious side, Matt thought. But he was such a pussy, Jacobs went on. Yeah, right. If you knew what I'd been through, you wouldn't be calling me a pussy. Oh, is that it? Aw, you poor thing, Jacobs laughed. Such a fucking whiner, Blair. So what's your story? Me? Jacobs said. He seemed surprised. It's my story. He looked at Matt with serious eyes and laughed. Oh, you're the funny guy now, Matt said. And they both laughed. I'm no one from nowhere, Jacob said. They laughed again. Okay, don't tell me, Matt said. They both felt something. In the middle of chaos, there was suddenly a sense of brotherhood, a sense of friendship. This was something Matt had not felt for a lifetime. Jacobs offered Matt something out of the bleak life he had gained at the lodge. He was older, wiser, stronger. These things that Matt saw in him lit a redemptive fire within him. He wanted to follow him. He was charismatic, funny, and serious when he had to be. Jacobs had changed everything for Matt. The next morning, Matt woke to the sun. He felt better than he had in ages. His arm and ribs finally seemed to be healing. The pain was not as bad as it had been. He went to the open door to leave his room. Jacobs was already waiting just outside. You gonna sleep all day, Blair? He said, just like Matt's old drill sergeant. What? Matt didn't get it. Meet me downstairs in 5 minutes. We're leaving. I need to brief you before I go. All the military jargon put Matt right back in the WPF. He dressed quickly and met Jacobs in the dining hall. We're heading back east. We're probably all infected by the radiation, so we're going to get done what we can. Radiation meds will be high on the priority list, Jacobs said. We're packed and ready. We should be back in 3 to 6 weeks. I was going to leave 2 of my guys behind, but I'm only leaving 1 for now. It seems you might have someone who's up for the job. And just then, John came walking up. Jacobs nodded to him. I'm sure we can take care of things, Matt said. Now, if we don't come back, you're going to have to decide what to do with these people. Keep close guard 24/7 on the perimeters. Don't trust anyone. Not even me. He gave a fathering look to John and Matt. We're leaving. With that, Jacobs walked out the door with his other men. They left with a plan of their own. They would return with refugees to this safe haven. Jacobs brought a new hope to Matt. He provided a window to the outside world. He offered news of what was happening. This fueled Matt for many weeks after he left. It was October. The weather was growing colder. It seemed even unseasonably so. Nonetheless, Matt had kept up his hope. He hoped he would soon see Jacobs again and be part of his cause. A close watch was kept on the perimeter. John and Matt headed up the guard, with John taking the day shift and Matt the night. It was pretty quiet, though. There was one recent scare. Jimmy came back after being gone 2 weeks. He returned with a bus full of people. They were frantic, as the survivors of the Pennsylvania bombings were. Still, they put them up in the lodge. Angela took care of the wounded and sick. She brought them food and drinks. Matt and John made a habit of going to the nearest town and taking the food off the shelves. They had to maintain the food supply. In these towns, people were scarce. John and Matt hoped to hear from Jacob soon. They anticipated every minute of every shift that they would get word from him that he would return. It was the night of October 30th, an eerie night. It was, after all, Halloween. Matt had a feeling that tonight he would see the return of Jacobs. It had been almost 6 weeks to the day. Jacobs had promised to return by this time, and so Matt thought it had to be today. He was so sure that he had convinced John and the others to keep guard with him that night. This way, they could be welcomed by more than just he. The silver of a moon shone high in the sky. Slight cloud cover moved in. Walking around the woods, the men anxiously awaited the return. The night was quiet, though. The wind blew. As the breeze became splintering cold, Matt met up with John in the woods. "Any sign of anything?" Matt asked. "Nope." "Keep your eyes open." John nodded. He was a man of few words. Still physically remembering a boy, he was all of 17 years old. Matt felt so much older than him. And when John was around, Matt acted like he was. John had a tense disposition about him. He never let this up. He was tense all the time. He was definitely a man of duty. That made it easy for Matt to work with him. He gladly accepted Matt's orders. Matt made his way around to the others. "Davis," he called out. "Have you seen anything?" "Nothing." Matt looked around in disappointment. He knew tonight would be the night Jacobs came back. It seemed so certain. Matt could feel it. He made his way to the rear perimeter guard. He thought of Russ and how he was so scared of the night. He was the last to volunteer to do the night watch, and he only volunteered after everyone else did. He didn't want to appear the coward. He was a strange, paranoid sort of person. Matt thought of his and Jacob's conversation outside the lodge that night. Now Russ, he was a pussy. Matt thought he would tell Jacobs. "Russ!" Matt called out in a loud whisper. "Russ, where the hell are you?" He was nowhere in sight. Matt became frustrated. Where did he disappear to? He was letting the whole rear perimeter go unchecked. Where the hell was he? Matt began walking into the woods. "Russ!" he called again. Nothing. Matt began thinking he'd have to use his flashlight. He tried to avoid this. That way Jacobs wouldn't be on him about making himself vulnerable to attack. As soon as he lit up his light, that would be when Jacobs would show up. This made him pretty angry. He let his gun hang to his side, got out his flashlight. He held it in his unslinged arm and shined it through the trees. He saw nothing. Further into the woods, he was careful not to lose his sense of direction. Matt walked about a quarter of a mile. Still, no sign of Russ. He kept calling, and still, nothing. Matt heard a rustle in the fallen leaves behind him. He turned. "Russ?" Matt called. There was no answer. Was it Jacob's men? "Jacobs?" he called in a whisper. He heard nothing but the wind now. He went towards the sound, shined his light. To the left and the right. He heard the sound directly behind him. Matt tensed. He slowly turned, switching the flashlight into his bad hand, gripping his gun with his good hand that hung at his side. A pair of eyes stared back at him. A deer turned and bolted. Matt sighed, lowering his gun. The relief shot through his body. The fear left him. It was just a deer. But still, there was no sign of Russ. Matt retraced his steps back to the lodge. He exited the tree line. He thought he heard something once again. Stopping in his tracks, he heard only silence, and then footsteps off in the distance. It was the sound of someone running. It was coming his way. He turned. He saw nothing. He fumbled for his flashlight with his bad right arm. He shined it into the woods. Another deer, running through the trees, stopped and stared into the light. Matt shook his head and sighed once again. He turned back. Where is Russ? He thought. Matt ran around to the front of the lodge, keeping John up to date. I don't know where he's at, Matt said. I'm going to cover the rear. Let me know when you see them." John obliged. Matt headed to the rear of the perimeter. Morning came. No sign of either Jacobs or Russ. Matt sent John to get some sleep. He continued his watch into the afternoon. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but still there was no sign of Jacobs. No sign of Russ. John rose from a short rest and found Matt outside. "We haven't heard from Russ yet," Matt said, as his tired eyes stared into the woods. "Sent a few guys to go look. They found nothing. Let's go see what we can find." They set off into the woods. There was little word shared. This Russ guy was a gamble, a loose cannon. He was terrified of what was going on and just didn't have the wits to maintain himself. It was always the scared ones that endangered the group. When Matt had explained to the others what he heard from Jacobs, Russ seemed to start collapsing on the inside. He was a big man, light blonde hair, maybe 6'3". He wasn't very worldly, though. He had never left Pennsylvania. The fact that he disappeared like this was scary to both John and Matt. Russ would be terrified to be out in the night, the big oaf-looking guy. But he wasn't a complainer. He'd rather stand outside all night in horror than complain. "Let's split up," Matt said. "You go east about a mile or so, then head back this way. Meet me here in about 20 minutes. The pair split. John trudged his way in a jog through the fallen leaves. November was now here. They hadn't seen anything from the outside world. Only Jimmy coming back with all the injured people a few weeks back. John hated being in the lodge. It was now full of sick, burnt people. It was hard to keep up hope. Matt had spent most of his time outside, not sleeping much. John noted this. Matt had suddenly become this army guy, not afraid of anything. John had a hard time remembering what it was that happened before all this. He had hardly remembered the crash. He still had a hard time remembering what he was doing on that plane. Amnesia was no joke. It was real, and it had become his reality. All he felt was intense feelings. There was no logic or thought behind them. It was like he was trying to prove something to someone. But still, he did not remember his family or where he was from. Truth be told, he didn't even know who he was. He only knew his name. "I think my name is John," he thought. And this was terrifying. Matt had confronted him about the way he acted after the crash. This worried him. He would not tell anyone what he was going through. Instead, he kept it to himself. John saw something or someone lying in the leaves. He squinted his eyes in the bright sun. He could make out a figure lying twisted up in a tree root. It was Russ. He was as white as a ghost, lying on the ground. His leg twisted around a tree root, his foot pointing the wrong way. It was obviously badly broken. He was unconscious. It was hard to tell if he was breathing. "Russ!" John shook him. "Hey, Russ!" He looked dead, but John wouldn't believe it. Russ opened his eyes, looking around in fear. He didn't seem to have any idea what was happening or what had happened. "Russ," John said again. "It's John. Your leg is broken, and I don't know what else. I'm going to get a stretcher. Stay right here." Russ didn't speak. He just nodded that he understood. John hopped up and ran through the woods. "Matt!" John called. "I found him." Matt ran towards them, his arm in the sling held close to his side. Matt ran right beside John, following. He was ready to lead as soon as he could see where Russ was. John carried a light stretcher. They loaded him onto it. Matt carried the stretcher with his one good left hand on the head side of the stretcher. It was a slow walk, Matt only with one good arm. "Russ, what happened?" There was confusion in his eyes. They continued to walk to the lodge. The third floor of the lodge wasn't a place Matt liked to go. It was full of people that were basically going to die. Charlotte had been a nurse to every one of them, bringing them food and water and changing bandages. She had taken Angela into her service. Angela was always excited to see Matt. She was not allowed out of the lodge without him. He was out most of the time these days, and she only got to see him when he came to her. "Matt!" came her little voice, running down the hall. Matt knelt and hugged her. "Hey, little angel," Matt said as he hugged her. "Are you taking care of everyone?" "Yeah, but they're all real sick, Matt. Can you help them?" Charlotte came walking into the hall with a concerned look. She shut the door, in which she and Angela were. "Hi, Matt," Charlotte said. "Somebody's missed you." "Matt!" Angela excitedly said. "You want to meet my new friend Billy?" "Yeah," Matt said, mustering the excitement as she led him away. Charlotte stood in front of the door, not allowing them to enter. She glared at Matt, with tears behind her eyes. Angela studied their body language. She looked angered and perplexed with her deduction from it. "Oh no," Angela said. "Is Billy dead now too?" Matt looked down on his little Angela. There was no answer, and she didn't expect one. Charla pulled Matt aside. "Get her out of here for a while, would you? You haven't been around for days. She's 7 and she's watching everyone here and die. She should not be seeing this." Charla scolded Matt, as if he were really her father. He accepted the responsibility. Matt sullenly shook his head. "Come on, Ange," Matt said. Matt and little Angela walked out of the lodge. John sat in his room, trying to remember. He could recall nothing. He knew his own name, maybe, but he didn't know his family, where he came from, or anything of his past. He had a tattoo of a dragon on his forearm. It revealed nothing to him. He wanted to tell Matt. He should tell Matt. John wanted to tell someone. He was alone in this, but Matt had no one to help him with the perimeter watches. If he saw John unfit, he would not want his help anymore. He already had too much on his hands, trying to keep the perimeter and Angela and all. He couldn't tell Matt the truth. He just had to keep trying to remember. He had to keep trying to put everything together. The middle of November brought the first snow of the year. It was heavy snow. Matt had created a schedule for himself. He would spend the day with Angela and keep the night watching the perimeter, as Jacobs had advised him. Even so, there was still no sign of him. It was well beyond his 6-week promised return date. Matt deduced that Russ had been scared in the night and ran. Panicked, he tripped over the tree root, breaking his leg. He was not cut out for perimeter watch. Jimmy and Charlotte did what they could to help him recover. They set the bone the best way they could. There was no doctor at the lodge. The bone would never fully heal, and it certainly wouldn't heal correctly. Matt's show of stability had gained him new favor with the others at the lodge. He now had 7 others sharing the watch with him. At first, they were pretty apathetic to their situation, but now they intended to help Matt in his cause. John was especially helpful. He acted as Matt's right-hand man. He helped organize and was cooperative enough to help keep things going as they should. There was no sign of anything from the outside world, though. The highway never had any traffic. Now it was covered in snow. Anyone would be hard put to even find the highway. Matt became concerned for the people at the lodge. Some of the burned need doctors and medicine badly. He progressively felt the increasing need for a doctor. Jacobs told him not to go to Philadelphia. It wasn't safe. All he could do was wait for him to get back. It was getting bad, though. Soon, the time was coming when they couldn't wait any longer. He'd have to do something then. And still, some of the others showed little interest in helping. They were all perfectly content, acting like none of it was going on. In denial, perhaps. It was easier for them that way. It was how they were coping. Matt was grateful that no one tried to leave. Yet at the same time, it was inevitable someone would try at some point. This would be a concern come spring. For now, they had to settle in for the long winter. Matt could only wait and hope that Jacobs would be back soon. They could talk these things over. For the time being, he had to make a home for everyone at the lodge, as winter quickly closed on them. This has been a presentation of The Landscape of a Heart. Copyright 2020 by R.P. Watts. Chapter 6, Jacobs. Stay tuned next week for Chapter 7, Winter. Subscribe to this feed